Thank you so much for talking to me. This is really great.
Absolutely. Yeah, normally I don't get to be in drag for something like this, but it was a good timing that I have to be in drag today anyway.
Yeah,
So,
that worked out
yeah,
really well.
there's Michael.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for taking time to talk to me about the podcast. I love it.
Well,
I'm
thank you so much.
I'm in the middle of the Jawbreaker episode, and I've listened to. I didn't listen to the first one because I haven't seen Vegas in Space yet, and I feel like I want to watch the movie before I listen to the episode.
Right.
Well,
But
let us be your reason to watch Vegas in Space, please. I would love that.
it's in my queue. I swear, I've been meaning to watch it. And Phantom of the Paradise I've always been a fan of that movie, so that was kind of. And I've been following, like, keeping up. When you first announced the podcast, I kind of was, following up and like just checking to see when it came out. And so I'm really glad it's here. So
Thank you.
I guess to start out, can you just give me a little bit of your background and kind of how you got together and how you started up the podcast?
Go ahead, Michael.
Sure. Well, Peaches and I met in the mid-thousands. I was in the process of working on a book about horror hosts, which sadly never came out. And I had been looking to see what the natural extension of the late night horror host and creature feature host was in a modern era. And I stumbled upon Peach's website and saw what she was doing with this marvelous show called Midnight Mass in the Bay Area. And I had intended to just do a quick interview with her. And next thing you know, years of friendship were forged over a conversation because we both discovered we were kindred spirits and loved all of these same strange, culty movies. And then in 2010, when Peaches took her movie on the road, I went with her to document that journey, and I will let her kind of speak to that and to Midnight Mass as an experience. But yeah, that's how we met and how we began, and here we are all this time later.
Yeah, that was such a unique situation because Michael, who I hadn't met in person, was so enthusiastic about the way we were releasing my film All About Evil. And we were doing this sort of William Castle style road show where we were taking it from market to market. And, sometimes Mink Stoll would be with us, or Cassandra Peterson or Natasha Lyonne, depending on what city we were in. And we would do a big Peaches show before the movie screening, and then the film would play in that market. But usually we did this big show with local drag queens, and very much it was true to what we would do at Midnight Mass. And Michael said, do you have anyone who's documenting this for you as you go across the country? And I said no, and we can't afford it. We were so low budget. And Michael said, look, if I can crash in your guys's hotel rooms and this and that. And so we kind of negotiated a deal where it was like Michael was part roadie and documentarian, and he joined our crew. And there's no better way to get to know someone intimately.
Yes.
You know how they smell in the morning, then to go on the road together where, we were often it would be like 4 or 5 of us crashing in one hotel room and then Mink Stoll would have her own room, or so it was very intimate, and Michael and I became really close. And then over the years we just started collaborating together on my stage shows and other projects, writing projects, and then recently we've really collaborated together a lot. And so when thinking about doing a podcast like everyone in the world is doing right now, it was kind of like, okay, if I'm going to do a Peaches Christ podcast, the thing that I need to do is create it so that I'm interested in doing it regardless of whether or not it can be monetized. Because who knows, who knows if it'll take off or not. And I knew that if I did it with Michael, who I enjoy nerding out with so much about cult movies, that it would be a worthy endeavor, because it's a subject that I love, I'm passionate about. And that's really what kind of kicked it all off.
Okay, well, where did both of your love for all things cult come from? Like, what were your what inspired you? I mean, I could tell my story, but I want to hear yours.
Peaches?
Well, it's one of those questions that obviously I've been asked a lot, and I do try to come up with new answers, but you can't, because then you're just lying. But well, I do that too. But I really think that it is something that I was just kind of born with, because I loved anything dark, anything spooky, anything weird. That's what I connected to. And my parents actually, say, like, I was, mesmerized by Elvira. I loved schlocky movies. I loved horror and spooky stuff. So it really just started from childhood, and it was all the stuff. It was realizing that there was this community, especially through the discovery of Fangoria magazine, and subscribing to Fangoria magazine, and then meeting fans, like having pen pals, back in the 80s, and meeting fans of these weird movies, and, reading books by, John Waters, where shock value, his book was such an introduction to me into this whole other world, right? John's book, because I love John Waters. I grew up in Maryland. I read shock value. It meant the world to me, because John introduced me to Russ Meyer, Herschel Gordon Lewis, Ted V. Michaels, Doris Wishman, on and on, the Kuchar brothers. And I couldn't get enough of it. Part of it might be that I was able to make it a hobby, because there was no internet. There wasn't the accessibility. You really had to work hard to track down these titles. It's often I'd read about a movie for years before I could ever find a copy of it. So it was like a passion for me as a kid, and it's never left.
Yeah, similarly, I came to cult movies because Peaches speaks about her love of Elvira and being transfixed by Elvira. I grew up with a show called USA Up All Night, which aired in the late 80s into the early 90s. And I've told the story often, but USA Up All Night did a double feature of Attack of the Killer Tomatoes and Return of the Killer Tomatoes. And when I saw that in the TV guide as a little kid, I was like, I don't know what that is, but I don't know how tomatoes can be killer, and I need to know. And watching that double feature, although it's a horror comedy and not necessarily horror, it was weird and out there, and it was sort of baptism by cult, because by morning, having watched both movies, I became aware that there was this whole other world of movies out there that my friends weren't talking about at school, that they weren't playing at the multiplex. And I was sort of drawn to that forbidden nature of those things. And so when I would go to the video store, I would start walking the aisles and look at the different covers of the things that seemed a little out there or strange. And as I rented those movies and watched those things, I realized that those were the things that were made for me and that spoke to me. And as I grew up and started writing and becoming interested in making films myself, I that was always what I gravitated towards the people who make the outside of the lines kind of work. And as Peaches said, finding community is very key. I worked for a horror movie magazine right out of college called Ultra Violent. We were committed to exploitation cinema. And I met a lot of people on the road at conventions, kind of in a pre-internet era, where I got to connect with regional filmmakers or people like Lloyd Kaufman or Richard Griffin in New England, these guys who were making these movies that you knew Paramount wasn't going to make, but were just as strange, just so strange and weird and far more interesting. And yeah, and I've been obsessed my whole life. So.
Okay. And I know it's like probably trying to pick out your favorite child, but do you have a favorite cult film?
You're right, it is. Yeah. But I would say that because I do think of John Waters as being my greatest, hero, and he's become a friend and a mentor over the years. That, like, John's influence on me and what he lit up in my life is kind of runs a parallel course to the Rocky Horror Picture Show in terms of, I would say John Waters. I know that's not a movie, but John Waters as the canon and auteur plus the discovery of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And it's not a coincidence that both those discoveries had integrated drag into the cult movie experience through Frankenfurter and Divine. So if I could just, kind of cheat and say John Waters plus Rocky Horror Picture Show, that double feature, it really is what helped give birth to this.
Well, and I have to echo, I think that if you are a devotee to cult, you can't not pay respect to Rocky Horror, because I think that Rocky Horror set the standard for how we can build communities and celebrate these kind of movies that exist on the outside. And when I was growing up and looking at things like Attack of the Killer Tomatoes or El Topo, Night of the Living Dead, and they were playing these midnight screenings, there's then this outlier that it's not only getting midnight screenings, but people are coming and celebrating it like a rock concert. And of course, when you're like in this world, you want to know more about that. And I was obsessed with Rocky Horror to the point where I also would drive to different screenings of it to see different casts, as well as I remember, having my parents drive me before I could drive to different video stores to find Shock Treatment, the follow-up movie for it. So Rocky Horror is really kind of that crucial bit of DNA. I do love Attack of the Killer Tomatoes still to this day because it was my origin piece. So those, always something a little strange, a little queer.
Well, I've enjoyed the podcast so far, especially because it's a more unique take on your average, like a lot of the film podcasts, they kind of just go through the movie and say, and then this happened, and then this happened. Like, how did you decide to set up your podcast where it's more like interviews and more like personal, and more looking into the cult of films instead of just like, here's what happened in this movie?
I think honestly, when we realized we were going to go back to sort of my roots as the Midnight Mass impresario, we looked at how that would translate best to an audio form. So Midnight Mass was a raucous celebration inspired by Rocky Horror of our favorite movies, but ultimately what it really did, and what I tried to do most importantly, was sort of create a church-like environment to worship these films, meaning that the congregation had to be part of the show, and the cult, there was no fourth wall, so the cult was actively engaged. We would tell the cult, to dress up. We would have costume contests. We would do, we'd have put lap dancers in the audience for showgirl screenings, so that there was very much this show that we were all a part of. And it was like, well, it's very hard to do that in a podcast form. Like, we need to create something that people can listen to, but specifically, there are enough podcasts out there about movies themselves and the trivia around movies and the history of those movies. And I love those podcasts. I listen to those podcasts. But what we could do was sort of get into the nitty gritty of really interviewing the people involved in the making of them. And specifically, what's your relationship to this thing, this community, this cult now that has formed around something that you made maybe 30, 40 years ago that you couldn't have imagined you'd still be talking about this many years later. As well as we interview people from the cult itself. So the icons, the fans that have done so much, that they've become the high priests and the high nuns of this, cult movement. So that was our sort of our idea for moving forward with a podcast, and we're figuring it out as we go.
Right. Well, and one of the things when I describe it to people is that in a lot of ways, it's an audio documentary, because as Peaches mentioned, we'll talk to someone involved in the film or so deeply influenced by the film that it's impacted their career, as well as artists and super fans and obsessed devotees to these movies to learn how it's permeated culture, but their lives. And what's really cool for us is obviously we don't pick a movie that we ourselves don't worship. Like, we love every single one of these things that we're putting on, from the kind of like deep cut titles to the highly celebrated ones. But what's been wonderful about it is, even though we love these movies, through each of these conversations, we're learning something new that is forcing us to reassess it and love it in a whole new way. Like you had mentioned, you listened to the Phantom of the Paradise episode. One of the great joys of that episode, I think, we thought we could just spend an hour and a half talking about the movie itself. And then we discovered this bizarre phenomenon that it was a hit in Winnipeg, Canada in 1974 and nowhere else.
Mhm.
And we were blown away by that. Like there's a sociology there that's never been repeated with any film ever. So in this kind of way. And that's what we love. We love to find those little gems.
Okay. I don't want to like get into like spoilersy because you guys have been a little cagey about like your future things. What is, you don't have to tell me, but what's been your favorite episode to record so far?
Wow, that's really tough. I think maybe right now it might be the Friday the 13th episode, partly because it was so unexpected and so sudden and lovely. You know, Michael actually saw that there was a Friday the 13th like a week and a half away, right, on the calendar. And he goes, oh God, we really should have thought about that. How cool would it have been to put out a Friday the 13th podcast? And then we kind of were talking and you know, he said, well, there's maybe still time. And so it was this weird series of events where I had just heard from another friend of mine about this book, the Final Girl Support Group. And so I mentioned that to Michael. Michael says, oh, I know Grady. Let me reach out to him. I also know Adrienne King, who's very, featured in the book she narrates it. She's, not only the first final girl of the Friday the 13th series, but she is the narrator of the audiobook of Grady's. And the fact that the two of them jumped on board to do the interview so quickly meant that I had to read that book in 2 or 3 days, which for me is like, I read books kind of slowly at night in bed. One book can last me quite a while. I'm kind of ashamed to admit, but this was kind of an amazing experience where it was like, okay, I'm just going to spend hours for a couple days just reading this book, and then to get to talk to them and have those interviews, and to have Adrienne speak so personally about her experience with a stalker and her life as a final girl kind of becoming reality after she left the film shoot. It was really like special and touching and dramatic, and and there was something just so lovely about it. Then I might also say that that's one of the more recent episodes we've recorded, so I tend to like the ones that we've done the most recently.
Right. Well, and I'll echo what Peaches says. I really do think that the Friday the 13th episode is special for all the reasons that she mentions, but also because of how quickly it came together and how organic and just powerful the conversation was. It showed to me what happens when all of our cylinders are firing together. Like it was proof positive that Midnight Mass is doing exactly what Midnight Mass should do. And I really was happy with that. I love every episode we've recorded. I will say, I want to clarify that we have had amazing guests, and we've got some really amazing guests to come. And there's not a one of them that when we release them that week, I listen to them when they go live with the audience, just because it's fun to do, because oftentimes it's many weeks removed from when we recorded it. And I find myself being transported right back to the conversation, and I'm proud of every episode. But yeah, the Friday the 13th one was great because of just how quickly it came together, for sure.
Okay. Is there like a dream get that you want for the show, like a topic or a guest or somebody that you haven't actually spoken with yet?
Well, I mean, so my dream guests are the same as I get asked this about my live show, because I've done so many live events with so many people I admire, and I'm really, really grateful and really lucky. Like when I start to list the names of all the people I've done shows with, even I'm like, wow, that's impressive, because so many of these people I grew up admiring. But there are two that have open invites who I'm would be happy if they do either the audio Midnight Mass or an in-person or both, and that would be Elizabeth Berkley, from Showgirls. I think because Showgirls is a movie I screened for 20 years annually, and I started doing it at a time when people didn't see it as a midnight movie. I really feel proud of helping build that cult. But I also feel like because of misogyny and the fucked up nature of the industry, Elizabeth Berkley was really unfairly crucified, for the response to that film, when really two men were responsible for the way that the movie came out, including directing her. And I would love for her, and I should say this, I get why it's a painful experience for her, and why that whole experience would have been traumatic. But I would love for her to come and see, like Michael said, we earnestly love these movies. We are not cynical screeners or exhibitors. We earnestly love the movies, and that's the crowd that we bring in. There is this sort of like new wave of people who enjoy hate watching, bad movies, and it's never really been that interesting to me.
Yeah.
I actually go, wait, I don't think this is a bad movie. I love this movie, and I would love for Elizabeth to experience that sort of love from true fans, people who really appreciate her. The other one who I'm terrified of, but would definitely still want to do a show with, would be Faye Dunaway. And, I don't know if I'd make it out alive, but I think she's so talented and so brilliant. And of course, much in the same way that Elizabeth was, unfairly thrown under the bus, I think Faye, for Mommy Dearest, delivered, an incredible performance that, is the reason Mommy Dearest is even, something we still screen or still talk about. And, I would love to, work with her someday, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think maybe Ms. Berkley will accept an invitation before Ms. Dunaway.
Yeah.
And like Peaches, Peaches knows that I would love to talk with Elizabeth Berkley as well, because Showgirls is really it. I mean, I love that movie so much, and I want to celebrate that movie with her. But something that we talk about frequently on the show, and obviously it's just by sheer proxy of who we are as creators and people, is sort of the queer crossover with a lot of the movies. And one thing that I've always been interested in are movies that have been adopted by queer audiences that weren't necessarily made by queer filmmakers. And for example, I mentioned Phantom of the Paradise, but Brian De Palma also made Carrie, which a lot of gay men reference quite frequently as a movie that they connect to because of the themes. And I would love to sit with someone like Brian De Palma and get his take on this other read of his work that I'm sure he didn't necessarily intend in the way that it's now being received. I would love to talk to him, or someone like Robert Zemeckis, who's known very much for these big budget movies, for something like Death Becomes Her. So those are guests I would love to have. I don't know if they're out there and listening. Please come and join us.
So you talk about like a lot of the films like I grew up with, I'm 52, so I've been through the 70s and all that stuff like that. What movies, like current movies, do you think are capable of achieving that cult status of something like a Phantom of Paradise or, anything like that?
That's a really interesting question, because I think that there's the cult movies that you and I, our generation, see as cult movies and understand as cult movies, things like the Russ Meyer films and Santa Sangre, or these films that were more obscure. They were harder to get. They were college fare. They were movies like A Clockwork Orange, or something that you would see at a screening. And then there's the sort of more modern cult movie where there are people who have grown up watching the same movie on cable television, or on VHS or DVD. For example, I did not grow up watching Hocus Pocus, and it was something I was probably a little too old for when it came out. And I remember, I think, dismissing it because I'd seen enough of it that I was like, that doesn't seem good, a Disney movie with witches. And then it was young people saying, when are you going to screen Hocus Pocus? When are you going to do Hocus Pocus? It was enough for me to go back and rewatch it and go, oh, I get it.
Yeah.
For this generation, this is their Elvira. These are three women who obviously, we know all three of them very much immersed in the queer community. So these are three, women basically doing drag performances, as these witches. And there's this whole generation of kids who grew up obsessing over this movie. So there's this weird thing where I kind of feel like there's these different categories now of cult movies, like sort of the nostalgia cult movie that just will never die, that people just, love, love, love. And then sort of the more weird, obscure film experience that people keep alive through word of mouth and, showing it to friends. That today, is an anomaly to me. I'm not sure. There are these movies that I see that I can tell someone's attempted to make a cult movie, and I actually think that's not easy to do.
Right.
Usually they happen by accident. So Michael, you probably have a better sense of something that's come out more recently. Like, how recently do you mean?
Well, I mean, just, anything that's come out like within the past like 10 years or so, like, like something like an Inception or a Tenet or something like that. Like, do you think anything like
Right.
that?
Well, so the reality is, and Peaches sort of spoke to this, is that in many ways, cult films aren't made, they're grown. That these movies a lot of times share this common theme of not necessarily landing with a larger audience right away, but they find their people, and by proxy, their people introduce it to more people, and it becomes that thing that over time it grows. I think of something like Josie and the Pussycats, which I was lucky enough to see come out when it came out that weekend in 2001. I was the only one in the theater, and nobody really talked about that movie for years. And now it has a huge cult following where it's getting these new vinyl releases and getting event screenings. But that all came from people discovering it on home video or DVD. And I think that the internet allows a new kind of discovery that we maybe are not as tuned into because it's not our generation. But movies like Jennifer's Body was not a huge hit when it came out, has now found a whole new audience a decade on, which I would say is a nouveau cult film, or things that I'm starting to hear grumblings about, like I Know Who Killed Me, the Lindsay Lohan movie, was not a hit at all, but all of a sudden I'm seeing people on the internet talking about it as if it was Mommy Dearest. And so I think it's just...
I have one.
Oh, yeah?
I thought of one as you were talking, because I was thinking, how has the internet affected the modern landscape? And I thought of one because I saw it right when it came out. It was like one of those movies where I really, really loved it. Didn't think it was going to be, it was an art house film, but through memes and, the internet, really memes, I think The Babadook ended up becoming this whole other pop culture phenomenon. It really could have been a sleeper horror movie, a very accomplished, brilliant. I loved that movie, but it really was the memes of the Babadook being gay or whatever that turned it into what I would now say is a cult movie.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's funny. I hadn't thought of that.
So, do you have any plans to take this show on the road, or are you bringing back the Midnight Mass shows? Like, what's coming up next for you both?
Actually, that is our ultimate goal. I think both Michael and I mean, my shows over the years have become popular enough as far as the live part of the show goes, that the live part of the show sort of took over, and these sort of parodies of cult movies and celebrations of cult movies ended up being more of the live experience, to the point where we were touring and no longer screening the movies and only doing the parodies. And while I love doing those shows, I really miss exhibition. I really miss screening a movie. And I especially miss getting to do things that are a little more niche, a little more obscure. And so I think Michael and I's hope is that the podcast, if we can reach enough people and we can go out on the road and maybe, take the cast from one of these films or some cast members and do an in-person Midnight Mass event with a screening, that would be, a really great, it might make the whole thing worth it. We really do want to do that.
Okay. And I had one question. The curiosity was killing me, Michael. I went through your IMDb, and how did you go from writing Christmas movies to, things like being a contributor at Fangoria and working with the Boulet brothers? Like, how did all that work out?
Well, the reality is those things are not mutually exclusive. What happened was I was working on the East Coast before I moved to LA, doing sort of these low budget writing script for low budget indie regional horror films. And I had decided to move to LA to continue my work as a screenwriter and hope to take it to the next level. And when I moved here, I had met a producer named Brian Nolan, who still is out there producing a lot of the movies you're watching on Hallmark and Lifetime today. And that particular year, his company that he worked for had been committed to do a series of movies for Christmas. And they had 4 movies, but they needed 5, and they needed a 5th one quite quickly. And he came to me and said, look, I know that with these horror movies, you're quite used to writing scripts with a tight turnaround and to a specific budget point. Do you think that you could bring that skill to the world of Christmas movies and write a Christmas movie? And up until that phone call, I had never thought about it, but I was like, okay, sure. And that movie was A Christmas Reunion starring Denise Richards and Patrick Muldoon. And it was the first of several Christmas movies that I ended up writing. And what I learned quite quickly is that although they seem very disparate, horror movies and Christmas movies, they're in their own way cult films, because the audiences of Christmas movies are just as rabid and just as enthusiastic. And just like a lot of horror movies, for example, there are kind of a series of rules that they like and expectations that they have for these films. And there's a whole little cabal of horror filmmakers who make Christmas movies. I write a lot of them. David Dakota, who is a very known property in the world of horror, he directs a lot of them. Ron Oliver, who made Prom Night 2, makes Christmas movies now. Sam Irvin, who directed Elvira's Haunted Hills, makes a lot of Christmas movies now. So yeah, it's a funny little crossover, but not as unlikely as you'd think.
Okay, that's a really good story. So one last question. If you wanted to like just introduce somebody into the world of cult films, what is the one film that you would recommend they see first?
I mean, I guess assuming they've already heard of and seen Rocky Horror Picture Show, I think, I would push them toward Pink Flamingos, because if you can't really handle Pink Flamingos, which still holds up, to this day, you screen Pink Flamingos for an audience. It is incredible that a movie made in the 70s can still deliver shock value to a satisfying degree. So my recommendation would be Pink Flamingos.
Okay.
Well, ironically enough, I was going to say Female Trouble. So it's still a double hit of John Waters.
Yeah.
Pink Flamingos was my first. I saw it in the theater. John Waters was touring with Hairspray, and they had a screening of Pink Flamingos with the Q&A. So I got to meet John Waters. I was very excited about that. So
yeah, that's amazing. I mean, Hairspray, when it was made in Maryland, was a big deal. And I, growing up, I was in junior high, and the fact that there was a movie being made, up the street from where I lived was just so fascinating, because Hollywood seemed so far away. But thank God, because that's really what led me to find Pink Flamingos at a completely inappropriately young age.
Exactly. Well, I wish you both the very best with the podcast. It's absolutely amazing. And I look forward to every episode coming out. And I'll make sure to promote all your social medias. And again, thank you so much for your time. It's so great to meet you virtually.
Absolutely. Likewise. Thank you so much.
Sure. And if you have any assets like pictures or like anything I can use to because I pulled things from your Instagrams, but if you have any like promotional pictures, high res that you would want to send along, that would be great.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.
All right, you too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.